This is page 9 of your interactive notebook, and we're going to talk about intensive and extensive properties of matter. So first we'll look at intensive properties of matter. Intensive properties are properties that do not depend on the size or mass of the system. So properties of matter that if I change how much matter I have, those properties don't also change. We talked about some of these in class whenever we did a warm-up, and we discussed properties of matter that are affected by mass and properties that are not mass dependent. So properties that are not mass dependent are intensive properties. So let's look on the left side of your interactive notebook at a few examples of intensive properties. First, we'll talk about temperature. In the beaker to the left, I have some water, and there's a thermometer in it that is reading 25 degrees Celsius, about room temperature. So if I take that water and pour about half of it out, and I have less water, which means that I have less mass, the temperature is going to be the same thing, because temperature is not mass dependent. I can change the mass of this system, but not affect the temperature. Therefore, it's an intensive property. Below that, I have an example of color. Color is also an intensive property. On the left, I have a cube. It's a pink cube. And if I break that cube apart into a bunch of smaller cubes, they're still going to be pink because the mass of the system doesn't affect the color. It doesn't matter whether I have a lot of this substance or small quantities of this substance, it still is pink. So those are intensive properties. Let's look back on the right of your laboratory notebook. We're going to skip down quite a bit actually to the bottom half and talk about extensive properties. And I did this on the bottom half because, of course, we're going to do some examples to the left of this for extensive properties, and I want to make sure you have plenty of space. Extensive properties are properties that do depend on the size or the mass of the system. So whenever we discussed the warm-up that I talked about earlier, we also talked about mass-dependent properties, and those would be extensive properties. So on the left side, some examples of extensive properties. Well, the first one is mass, which is kind of obvious, but obviously the amount of matter here does affect the mass. So I have a beaker with some water in it on the left that has a mass of 37.2 grams. If I were to pour some of that water out and have less matter in the system, the mass is going to go down to 29.4 grams. So mass is dependent, of course, on the amount of matter that you have. Below that I have volume. So I have a similar circumstance, but this time my water is in a graduated cylinder. And that graduated cylinder reads that I have 46.3 milliliters of water. And if I pour some of that out and the volume goes down to 21.0 milliliters, the reason it changed is because the mass changed, right? I lost some matter of the system, I got rid of it, so the volume also changed. So volume is mass dependent, which makes it an extensive property. So now that we've talked about some intensive and some extensive properties, I want you to think back to the lab that we did in class, the Investigate Density of Water lab. And based on the results that you got in that lab and the conclusion that you drew, I want you to consider whether density is an intensive or an extensive property. When we discussed the warm-up, I had a lot of people talk about density, and everybody mentioned it as an extensive property, as a property that was mass dependent. But having completed the lab, I want you to rethink that and consider, is it intensive or extensive? And if your decision changes, you can correct that warm-up, and if it doesn't, that's okay too. The last thing that you're going to do is glue in this physical and chemical properties worksheet to the left side. So in the left margin, next to your examples, you'll glue this worksheet in. We'll have it folded in half like we do a lot so that you can open it up and it's right there. And now these columns on the right that we didn't previously complete about intensive and extensive properties, you're going to complete at this point. So now the whole worksheet will be done. Remember, we've already done the physical and chemical property one, but for each of these properties now go back and also determine whether it's intensive or extensive, and then you'll be finished with page 9 of your interactive notebook on intensive and extensive properties.